The Insurrection Act. It sounds like something out of a history book, a relic of a bygone era. But this law, passed in 1807, is still alive, at the heart of debates about presidential power, the military's role at home, and the fragility of our democracy. The Insurrection Act gives the president authority to deploy the military within the country to quell domestic unrest. But the power to use the military against American citizens has always been a source of deep unease. The Insurrection Act was a compromise, balancing the need for order with the preservation of liberty, and that tension still resonates today. The Insurrection Act is not a blank check for presidential power. It outlines specific circumstances under which the president can invoke its authority. Firstly, the law mandates that the president can only deploy troops when a state is unable or unwilling to suppress an insurrection or rebellion that threatens the rule of law. This provision underscores the principle of federalism, recognizing the primacy of state power in most domestic matters. Secondly, the act requires a formal request from a state's legislature or governor before the president can send in federal troops. This requirement acts as a safeguard against unilateral presidential action, ensuring that states have a say in the deployment of military forces within their borders. However, the act does include an exception. The president can act without a state's consent if deemed necessary to enforce federal law or protect federal property. The Insurrection Act's language is broad, leaving room for interpretation regarding what constitutes an insurrection, or when a state is truly unable to enforce the law. This ambiguity has fueled debate about the potential for abuse, with critics arguing that the act could be used to suppress legitimate protest or target political opponents. The act's history, marked by both necessary interventions and controversial deployments, further complicates the picture. The Insurrection Act's legacy is etched in some of the most tumultuous episodes in American history. In 1957, President Eisenhower invoked the act to enforce the desegregation of Little Rock Central High School, sending in federal troops to protect 9 black students from violent resistance by white mobs. This landmark event underscored the federal government's commitment to upholding civil rights, even in the face of defiance from state and local authorities. Fast forward to the 1960s, and the act was called upon again during the civil rights movement. In 1962, President Kennedy federalized the Mississippi National Guard to enforce a court order admitting James Meredith, a black student, to the University of Mississippi. This action came amidst violent protests and riots, highlighting the act's role in protecting individual rights and upholding the rule of law. The act's use extended beyond the fight for racial justice. In 1967, President Johnson deployed federal troops to Detroit to quell race riots that had engulfed the city, resulting in widespread destruction and loss of life. Similarly, in 1992, President George H.W. Bush invoked the act to restore order in Los Angeles, following the acquittal of 4 police officers accused in the beating of Rodney King. These instances demonstrate the act's application in responding to widespread civil unrest and restoring order when local authorities were overwhelmed. The Insurrection Act is often conflated with martial law, but they are distinct legal concepts. While the act authorizes the use of the military domestically, it does not equate to the imposition of military rule. Martial law, a far more extreme measure, involves the temporary suspension of civilian government and the imposition of military control over all aspects of life. It's important to note that the Insurrection Act does not grant the president the authority to declare martial law. Under the Insurrection Act, military forces operate under the command of civilian authorities and are generally tasked with supporting law enforcement efforts. They do not assume the role of lawmakers or judges. Martial law, on the other hand, fundamentally alters the balance of power, with the military potentially assuming control over courts, law enforcement, and even basic government functions. The distinction between the two is crucial. The Insurrection Act, while controversial, provides a framework for military assistance to civilian authorities during times of crisis. Martial law, however, represents a complete breakdown of civilian control over the military, posing a grave threat to democratic norms and individual liberties. Understanding this difference is paramount in any discussion about the use of military force within the United States. The year is 2025, and the Insurrection Act is no longer a dusty historical footnote. It's at the center of a raging political firestorm. The issue? the U.S.-Mexico border. President Trump, in his second term, has declared a national emergency, citing an invasion of migrants. He's deployed over 10,000 troops to the border, and rumors are swirling that he's considering invoking the Insurrection Act. Trump's supporters argue that the situation at the border, with its reports of overflowing detention centers and overwhelmed Border Patrol agents, constitutes an insurrection that justifies the use of military force. They point to the act's broad language, arguing that the president has the authority to take whatever measures he deems necessary to secure the border. Opponents, however, are sounding the alarm. They argue that this is a blatant attempt to use the military for political purposes, to demonize migrants and score points with his base. They warn that deploying the military to address what is essentially a humanitarian crisis sets a dangerous precedent, further militarizing the border and undermining civilian control of the military. The potential invocation of the Insurrection Act at the border has sparked a flurry of debate among legal scholars. Some, like Risa Brooks of Marquette University, believe the act could be used to give the military a more active role in border enforcement. The military could be used to apprehend migrants or even clear streets, she suggests, highlighting the potential for an escalation of force. Others, like Corey Sheikh of the American Enterprise Institute, caution against conflating the act with martial law. The Insurrection Act doesn't mean martial law, Sheikh emphasizes. Civilian leadership would remain. She argues that while the act allows for military deployment, it doesn't automatically signify a military takeover of civilian functions. However, concerns about the act's potential for abuse remain high. Joseph Nunn of the Brennan Center for Justice stresses that the president has no authority to declare martial law and that the act is specifically designed for instances where the military can assist, not replace, civilian authorities. The Insurrection Act is not a blank check for presidential power, he warns. The Insurrection Act may seem like a relic of the past, but it's a potent reminder that the line between military force and civilian life is more tenuous than we might think. The ongoing debate about its potential use at the border forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the balance of power in our democracy. At its core, the act raises fundamental questions about the limits of presidential power, the role of the military in a democratic society, and the very definition of an insurrection. The answers to these questions have profound implications for the future of our republic. As citizens, it's our responsibility to engage in these debates, to understand the historical context of the Insurrection Act, and to be vigilant against its potential misuse. The future of our democracy may very well depend on it.